A bitter wind cuts through the hills of Bath as a woman in grey descends from a carriage, unmarried, unseen, and sold into silence. Elizabeth Langley has agreed to marry a man she's never met, a widowed duke who speaks of duty, not love. But behind the locked doors of Ashcombe House, nothing is as it seems. Whispers cling to the walls. The late Duchess's portrait still watches, and in the nursery, a music box plays on its own. What was meant to be a cold arrangement will soon awaken buried secrets and an impossible choice between the past and the heart. Tell us, where in the world are you listening from? And what is it about period romances that captures your imagination? Bath, England, winter of the year 1847. The mist clung to the city like a shroud, weaving its way between the Roman stones and the grand terraces, softening the sharp lines of reality. A light drizzle pattered against the windows of the modest boarding house where Miss Elizabeth Langley sat by the hearth, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her back impossibly straight, despite the chill that had seeped into the floorboards. She had once been called radiant. That was before the debts, before the auction of her father's library, before she had worn mourning black so long it had stained her soul deeper than the cloth. Now, at 34, Elizabeth was a woman composed of quiet strength and unshed tears. Her hazel green eyes held neither hope nor despair, but the steadiness of someone who had learned to expect little and endure much. The letter rested atop the tea table, opened and reread so many times that the wax seal had long since crumbled. It bore the crest of Ashcombe, a duke's seal, a man she had never met. He required a wife. Not a companion, not a lover, not a mistress of his house, only a mother to his daughters, and a name beside his at the next gathering of the peerage. The terms were plainly stated: no romance, no pretense of affection, a life of quiet respectability in exchange for her obedience and discretion. The arrangement, if accepted, would be formalized by carriage within the week. She had stared at the letter for a long while before giving her answer. And when she had written yes in trembling ink, she had done so not with foolish fantasy, but with solemn resolve. Ashcombe House awaited her. The journey from Bath Centre to the estate took 2 hours, though the time folded into silence like the hem of a heavy curtain. The carriage interior smelled of wool and damp leather. Elizabeth's travelling cloak was a faded navy, her bonnet simple, her gloves worn at the seams. Outside, the countryside blurred, grey trees against a sky the colour of wet slate. As they climbed the hill to Ashcombe's gate, the estate revealed itself not with grandeur, but with stillness. The iron gates creaked as they opened, and the house, of pale limestone, ivy-clad and flanked by skeletal yews, stood like a mausoleum carved by mourning hands. The windows stared blankly. No smoke curled from the chimneys. No servants bustled to greet her. Only silence. The coachman descended and opened the door. Elizabeth gathered her skirts and stepped onto the gravel, her boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. A woman stood at the entrance, sturdy, grey-capped, her hands folded before her apron. She did not smile. "Mrs. Graves." She introduced herself with a curtsy that felt more like a warning than a welcome. "Housekeeper." Elizabeth nodded. "Elizabeth Langley, Duchess of Ashcombe, as I understand." Mrs. Graves's expression did not falter. "This way, madam." No fanfare, no introductions. Only the long hallway of Ashcombe House opening before her like a throat ready to swallow. The corridor smelled of lavender water and dust. Oil portraits lined the walls, men with stern faces, women with high collars and downturned mouths, but none of them looked at her quite like the painting in the parlour. There, above the mantel, hung the former Duchess. She was beautiful, frighteningly so, fair and pale, her hair arranged with mathematical precision, her hands folded in her lap like porcelain. Her eyes, painted in lifelike grey, stared out with an intensity that struck Elizabeth like cold wind. The room seemed arranged around her portrait, as if no one had dared disturb it since her passing. A voice broke the hush. "Miss Langley." She turned. The Duke of Ashcombe stood at the threshold. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a black tailcoat and burgundy waistcoat. His cravat was perfect, not a thread out of place, but it was his eyes, grey-blue, unreadable, that drew hers. They did not flicker with curiosity or welcome. They observed, measured, withheld. Elizabeth curtsied with quiet precision. "Your Grace." He nodded once. "You arrived as agreed." "I did." He did not ask about her journey. He did not comment on the weather. He stepped forward, glancing at the portrait above the fireplace. His voice was smooth and cold as polished stone. "The girls rise at 7. Their governess left last week." Elizabeth lifted her gaze to meet his. "Will I be expected to replace her?" He paused. "I expect you to see to their upbringing and their decorum." She breathed in slowly. "As a wife might, or as a servant." His jaw tightened. "You will have a title, a room of your own. You are not here for affection, Miss Langley. I've no patience for illusion." A flicker of something, rage, sorrow, rose in her chest, but she swallowed it. She bowed her head. "As you wish, Your Grace." He nodded once, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the corridor as if they too carried distance. She was alone again, not entirely. A pair of eyes peeked from the stairwell. A little girl with honey-brown curls and a woolen rabbit in her arms. She watched Elizabeth with curiosity, not fear. Elizabeth smiled. The girl vanished. Upstairs, a door creaked softly. Ashcombe had many shadows. Elizabeth Langley, now Duchess of Ashcombe, in name if not in truth, stood in a house ruled by silence, under the gaze of a dead woman and beside a man who had not asked for a partner, but for a ghost to keep his ghosts at bay. And she had said yes. Ashcombe House did not breathe, as other homes did. It held its air in its chest, waiting. Every corridor, every panel of oak, every curtain heavy with velvet seemed to exist in a state of quiet restraint, as though the walls themselves feared awakening something best left sleeping. Elizabeth Langley stood alone in the drawing room as the hour approached noon. Outside, the winter sun fought against a dense fog that had rolled in from the river, cloaking the gardens in a silver blur. Inside, the light that filtered through the tall, mullioned windows struck dust motes into existence and cast pale shadows upon the faded rose-colored rug beneath her feet. A single fire crackled in the hearth, though no warmth came from it. She adjusted the lace cuffs of her dove-grey gown with fingers that trembled only slightly. This was not fear. No, not in the way one feared a man or illness or death. This was the unsettling sensation of having stepped into a place not quite aligned with the rest of the world. A house that seemed paused between moments, suspended in mourning, where voices were kept low and footsteps never echoed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, entered as precisely as a clock's chime. Her posture rigid, her starched apron spotless, she seemed made of creased linen and iron. Her gaze, brown and sharp, fell upon Elizabeth like a final verdict. "The children are in the schoolroom," she said. "You may join them now." Elizabeth nodded. "Thank you." She followed the housekeeper down a corridor that twisted like the spine of an old book. The air was cool, not from draughts, but from a kind of ancient stillness that clung to every corner. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashcombes staring from their gilded frames with expressions void of warmth. The late Duchess's image had been only the most recent in a lineage steeped in grandeur and restraint. At last, they arrived at a pale blue door, its paint slightly worn near the handle. Mrs. Graves gave one brisk knock, then turned the knob and stepped aside without further word. Elizabeth entered. The room was modest in size but orderly, with a round table in its center and shelves of worn books lining the walls. A globe sat in the corner, its surface yellowed and faded. Two girls looked up from their seats. Cecily, the younger, with her light brown curls and cheeks still plump with the softness of childhood, blinked at her with wide eyes. Her feet dangled from the chair, not yet long enough to touch the floor. Beside her sat Louisa. Louisa was older, 9, perhaps 10. There was a sharpness to her posture, a stillness that did not belong to children. Her hair was pinned back tightly, her dress immaculate, her expression unreadable. Elizabeth smiled gently and crossed the room. "Good morning," she said softly. "I am Elizabeth Langley." Cecily's eyes brightened. "Are you our new mother?" Louisa shot her a sharp glance, but the younger child seemed unaffected. Elizabeth knelt slowly to Cecily's level. "I am your father's wife," she said gently, "but I hope we may be friends." Cecily studied her with a seriousness that did not match her small frame. "I had a mother. She was very beautiful. She used to braid my hair." "I know," Elizabeth replied, her voice a thread of calm, "and I will never try to replace her, but I will do my best to care for you, as she would have wanted." Louisa closed her book with a deliberate snap. "We don't need you." Cecily flinched, but Elizabeth's gaze did not falter. She stood, turning toward the elder girl with quiet resolve. "Perhaps not, but I am here just the same." Louisa stared at her, eyes grey as a stormy sky. Then, with the silent dignity of one far older than her years, she turned away. Cecily reached out and slipped her small hand into Elizabeth's. The warmth of that gesture, so spontaneous, so full of unguarded trust, moved something deep within Elizabeth. She squeezed gently, then stood again. "Would you like to show me your favorite book, Cecily?" The little girl nodded and tugged her toward the shelf. Mrs. Graves lingered at the door, watching with a narrowed gaze that held no affection. Elizabeth glanced toward her briefly, meeting her eyes, and saw a flicker of judgment. Or was it something else? Warning, perhaps. Resentment. It was impossible to say. Later that afternoon, after luncheon had been taken in separate silence and the girls had returned to their quarters, Elizabeth found herself alone in the nursery. The room had been unused in some time, though signs of children remained, dolls arranged too precisely, toy horses with faded manes, a rocking chair that creaked without invitation. The fire had not been lit. She crossed to the hearth and bent to strike a match when a sound stopped her. A melody, faint, delicate. She rose slowly, heart tightening. The sound came from a music box, an ornate piece on the mantel, carved from cherry wood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Its lid had not been touched. The key at its side remained still, but the music played. A lullaby, gentle and haunting, filled the nursery. The air shifted. Elizabeth stepped back, the hair at the nape of her neck prickling. Then, faint but unmistakable, a laugh. A child's laugh. Soft, echoing from the hall. She turned at once, moving to the door, her steps soundless on the thick carpet. The corridor stretched long and dim. No figure stood there. No child ran past. The laughter had vanished. Elizabeth's breath trembled from her lips. She stepped into the corridor. "Louisa! Cecily!" No answer. She walked its length, pausing at each door, listening. Nothing. A door closed softly behind her. She turned. The nursery was as she had left it. Only the music box had gone silent. That evening, she dined alone. A single candle flickered on the table in the smaller dining room reserved for her use. Her plate was set precisely. The soup was warm. The bread was fresh. And yet the food held no taste. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed just beneath the ear, like a song one forgot had meaning. Somewhere above her, footsteps echoed, soft, deliberate, then gone. She wondered if Gideon dined with the children, if he spoke to them, if he laughed. She had not seen him since their exchange that morning. The fire burned low. She touched her locket, the one that held a miniature of her mother's face, painted long ago in happier days. She closed her eyes. She did not wish to be afraid. She had known loneliness, hardship, silence, but this was different. Ashcombe did not feel empty. It felt watched. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, she found her trunk carefully unpacked. Her gowns hung in the wardrobe, her brushes arranged neatly on the dressing table. A decanter of water waited on the nightstand, everything perfect, everything prepared, except she had not done it, and no one had knocked. She extinguished the candle and slipped beneath the heavy covers. The window rattled slightly in the wind. The branches outside scraped gently against the glass, like fingers trying to find their way back in. Then, a creak, a floorboard. She held her breath, but the sound passed, and the halls of Ashcombe returned to silence once more. The The morning unfolded beneath a sky of frozen pewter. The sun, pale and hesitant, refused to break through the low-hanging clouds that blanketed the estate in dull light. Frost clung to the edges of the windows, etching the glass in delicate patterns like lace woven by some unseen hand. The halls of Ashcombe remained hushed, the air heavy with what was left unsaid. Elizabeth Langley moved through the house with the grace of someone who understood that too much presence could disturb delicate balances. She was careful not to tread too heavily, not to raise her voice above the silence that ruled the place. But silence, she had learned, was not the same as peace. It was a veil, and behind veils, truth often hid with teeth. The girls had taken their breakfast in the nursery. Louisa ate without speaking, eyes lowered, spoon rising and falling with mechanical precision. Cecily leaned against Elizabeth's arm, humming a song that had no name, swinging her legs beneath the table as she nibbled toast with jam. The contrast between them felt like a bruise and a balm all at once. Elizabeth had waited until the children were gone before requesting to speak with the Duke. The study was a room of straight lines and shadows. The curtains were drawn against the morning, and the fire burned low, as if to conserve warmth for someone more deserving. Shelves lined the walls, filled with volumes bound in dark leather, their spines unbroken, untouched. Gideon Ashcombe stood near the window, a figure sculpted in dark wool, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed beyond the pane at a landscape only he could see. Elizabeth paused at the threshold. "You wished to speak with me?" His voice was low, measured, but it lacked warmth. She stepped forward, smoothing her skirt unconsciously. "Yes, Your Grace. It concerns the children." He did not turn. "Have they misbehaved?" "No, they've been quiet, respectful, but quietness is not always a sign of contentment, nor is speaking a guarantee of happiness." He turned then slowly and met her gaze. "What is your concern exactly?" She met his eyes without flinching. Louisa avoids eye contact. She flinches at sudden sounds. Cecily clings to me as though she expects to be torn away. I don't believe they've had any consistent female presence since their mother's passing. They need more than just structure, Your Grace. They need affection, reassurance. His expression did not shift. They have everything they require. Clothes, lessons, protection. Your role is to see that continues. Elizabeth's voice softened. But they need to feel safe. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, a shadow of something, pain perhaps, passed across his face. "Do not presume to understand my children after 3 days, madam. You are here to provide stability, not sentiment." She stiffened, the heat in her chest rising despite the cold that seemed to cling to his every word. "Forgive me, but I believe stability without compassion is little more than constraint." His jaw tightened. He turned from her again. "Your views have been noted." The conversation was over. She stood there a moment longer, hoping, foolishly, for another word. When none came, she turned and left, her footsteps silent on the Turkish rug. That evening the wind rattled the windows as the house sank into its customary silence. Elizabeth sat in the small reading salon near her chamber, a volume of poetry open in her lap, but unread. Her thoughts churned. A storm brewed outside, but it was nothing compared to the tension swelling within the house. The girls had been put to bed. The fire in the hearth had burned low. She closed the book and stood, ready to retire, when a piercing scream tore through the corridor. A child's scream. Elizabeth ran, her heart pounding, her slippers slipping against the polished floor as she reached the nursery door and flung it open. Louisa sat upright in bed, tangled in her sheets, her small chest heaving. Her eyes were wide with terror, and sweat clung to her brow. "No, don't take her, don't let her go, Isadora!" Elizabeth rushed to her side, sitting on the edge of the bed and gathering the trembling girl into her arms. "Louisa, hush, darling. It's only a dream." But Louisa's eyes did not see her. "She's gone. She said she'd come back." "Who, sweetheart? Who said that?" The girl gasped, blinked, and as though waking from a trance, buried her face into Elizabeth's shoulder. Elizabeth held her close, murmuring soft words of comfort, smoothing the girl's hair until her breathing began to steady. She remained with her until Louisa drifted into exhausted sleep once more. Carefully, she rose and adjusted the covers. Cecily stirred in the adjacent bed, her eyes fluttering open. "She says that name when she's sad," Cecily whispered, her voice small in the dim light. "Isadora." Elizabeth crossed the room and kissed the child's brow. "Go back to sleep, little one." But her own rest would not come. The name haunted her. Isadora. It was not the name of the Duchess. That much she knew. Yet the sound of it on Louisa's lips carried weight, like something pulled from memory, from grief. The next morning, Elizabeth found Mrs. Graves in the linen room, overseeing the folding of fresh sheets with the precision of a general. "I wish to ask you something," Elizabeth said, her tone polite, controlled. Mrs. Graves didn't look up. "Yes, madam?" "Who was Isadora?" The hands folding sheets slowed, but only for a heartbeat. "That name is not to be spoken in this house," the housekeeper said crisply. Louisa called it out in a nightmare. Mrs. Graves looked up then, her eyes sharper than glass. "Some names are better left where they belong, buried." Elizabeth's spine straightened. "If this person was connected to the children's distress, I should know." "You should tend to the living, Duchess," Mrs. Graves said coldly, "and not go chasing phantoms." The word echoed, phantoms. And for a moment Elizabeth thought she saw something flicker behind the housekeeper's expression. Not fear, not guilt, resentment. She said nothing more, but the question lodged itself like a thorn beneath her skin. That afternoon, she returned to the nursery while the children were at their lessons. The air felt colder than usual, though the fire had been recently stoked. The rocking chair sat still. A book lay open on the window seat. The dollhouse stood half shut. Elizabeth moved slowly, her gaze scanning the familiar space with new scrutiny. On the far wall hung a corkboard of sorts, covered in the girls' drawings. Mostly flowers, animals, lopsided portraits. But one stood out. Tucked behind a watercolor of a robin was a sketch, drawn in pencil and pressed against the cork with a single pin. 4 figures stood beneath a tree, 2 children, a tall man and a woman in a long gown with her arms outstretched. The style was childlike, but expressive. What chilled Elizabeth was the last detail. One of the figures, clearly the woman, had been violently crossed out. Pencil marks slashed over her form again and again, until nothing of her shape could be seen, only black, frantic strokes. Elizabeth stared at it, her pulse quickening. She did not touch it. She simply stood there, the silence of the nursery pressing in around her. Who had drawn it? And who had been erased? That night, as she lay in bed, she whispered the name once. Isadora. It carried a weight she did not yet understand. But she would. Winter deepened its hold on Ashcombe as January waned, the sky often low and dull as tarnished silver, and the land cloaked in an unrelenting hush of frost. It was the kind of cold that crept in through stone walls and settled in one's bones, a silence that stretched beyond weather, a silence that had lived inside the house long before Elizabeth Langley arrived. And yet, within that silence, she began to move. Not with force, but with consistency. Elizabeth rose each morning before the sun, dressed in modest woolen gowns of dove grey or forest green, and tied her chestnut hair back in its habitual low twist. She wore no perfume, no jewels beyond the brooch clasped at her collar, yet her presence began to stain the corners of Ashcombe like a slow seep of warmth through a frozen pane. The children responded first. Cecily now reached for her hand unprompted, climbing into her lap with picture books and questions. She whispered secrets into Elizabeth's ear, childish fancies about dreams, the names of the garden robins, and the song she imagined her mother still sang from beyond the clouds. Louisa was slower to thaw. She maintained her rigid composure, correcting Cecily's grammar, keeping her hands folded during lessons. But her eyes followed Elizabeth. She watched the way the Duchess tied ribbons with gentle hands, the way she spoke to the staff with dignity, and the way she never forced her company, but simply remained, present, unwavering, patient. It was a presence the house had not known since before the previous Duchess's laughter had faded into memory. But not everyone welcomed the change. Elizabeth began noticing it in glances exchanged by the maids, in sudden silence that fell when she entered a room, in voices hushed too quickly. She had lived long enough on the edges of fine households to recognize the signs of whispers left unspoken in her presence. The Ashcombe staff respected her station. They curtsied, they obeyed, they answered when addressed. But something old and brittle kept them from embracing her as mistress of the house. One afternoon, as the fog rolled thick across the gardens and the girls were with their music tutor, Elizabeth wandered the second floor, following a corridor she had not fully explored. The tapestries along the wall depicted faded scenes of medieval courts, their threads dulled with age. At the far end of the corridor, she found a door. Unlike the others, this one bore a brass plate, its letters nearly worn away but still legible. Duchess's dressing room. She reached for the handle. It did not turn. Locked. A strange stillness pressed in around her as she stood there, hand on the doorknob. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Elizabeth took a step back, her fingers tingling. As she turned to leave, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. At the bend of the corridor stood Mrs. Graves. The housekeeper's face was unreadable, her hands clasped before her apron, her eyes narrow with a gaze that landed like a blade. "That room is no longer in use," she said. "Per His Grace's instruction." Elizabeth met her stare without blinking. "There are many rooms no longer in use, but none of them are locked." Mrs. Graves's lips pressed into a thin line. "That room belonged to the late Duchess. Out of respect, it remains closed." "Or out of fear?" Elizabeth asked quietly. The older woman's eyes hardened. "Some things in this house are best left where they rest." Elizabeth did not answer. She simply turned and walked away. That evening, as rain tapped lightly against the window panes and the fire in her sitting room glowed with amber light, Elizabeth sat before her sewing basket, working the hem of Cecily's sleeve. The lamp cast warm shadows, and the sound of the fire crackling was the only voice in the room, until her needle struck something hard. She frowned, reaching into the folds of linen and thread. Her fingers closed around something cool and metallic, a key. She drew it out slowly, her breath catching. It was small, old-fashioned, made of brass, and wrapped tightly around its shaft was a ribbon, wine red, the shade of dried roses. It was delicate, soft, finely woven, not hers. Elizabeth turned the key in her hand, heart beating slow and deep. No note, no explanation, but there was no doubt. Someone had given her access. Someone within these walls wanted her to see what had been locked away. She slept little that night, her thoughts drifting like the fog across the moors beyond the manor. Was it Louisa? The child had grown more watchful each day, or perhaps Cecily, stumbling upon a hidden drawer, or one of the maids, silent and complicit in some truth none dared speak aloud, or someone else? The following morning, she moved through the house with the same measured grace she had adopted since her arrival. No haste, no tremble in her voice, but her eyes caught every glance, every murmur behind the doorways she passed. She tended to the girls, oversaw their lessons, sipped tea beside Cecily as they sorted buttons into tin boxes, and listened patiently to Louisa's slow reading from a French primer. But all the while the key burned cold against her skin, tucked into the pocket of her gown. Late that afternoon, as the sky turned to pearl grey and the house slid into its familiar hush, Elizabeth stood once more at the door to the dressing room. She glanced over her shoulder. The corridor was empty. The silence wrapped around her like velvet. She reached into her pocket, drew the key, and slid it into the lock. It turned. A click echoed into the corridor like a whisper finally spoken aloud. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed open the door. Inside, the air was different, cooler, untouched. Dust shimmered in the narrow beam of light that fell from the tall windows, their curtains drawn halfway. The scent of lavender water and fading paper still lingered, fragile and lingering. It was as if the room had waited for her. A chaise lounge stood beneath the window, its cushions still indented. A vanity covered in silver-backed brushes and perfume bottles sat near the fireplace. A pair of slippers, delicate heeled satin. rested just beside a tall cheval mirror, and on the dressing table a porcelain hair comb. Elizabeth stepped forward slowly, her fingers brushing over the comb. A strand of hair, fine, golden blonde, clung to one of its teeth. She stared at it for a long moment, then turned toward the armoire. It stood half open, revealing gowns of deep jewel tones, plum, emerald, navy, each carefully hung, untouched by moth or mildew, and beneath them, a box. She reached for it. Just as her fingers closed around the lid, a sound tore through the quiet, a whisper, not in words, but the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Elizabeth turned slowly. No one stood in the doorway, but the key, her key, was gone from the lock. The door was ajar, and somewhere in the heart of Ashcombe House a silence turned colder, as if the house had realized she had entered. The morning rose brittle and white, the landscape of Ashcombe painted in frost and silence. The earth wore a veil of stillness, and every branch, every hedge, every statue in the garden stood encrusted in delicate ice, as though the world itself had been carved from memory and regret. The hooves of the horses crunched against the path with a slow, muffled rhythm, their breath steaming like ghostly smoke into the cold air. Elizabeth Langley sat bundled in the open sleigh beside the Duke of Ashcombe, her gloved hands folded carefully over her lap, the fur-lined blanket draped across her legs, offering little defense against the chill that reached deeper than skin. Beside her, Gideon said nothing, his posture upright, his gaze fixed ahead. His expression was unreadable, but the line of his jaw, the tightness of his mouth, spoke of tension not yet released. It had been his invitation, delivered without flourish the night before, his voice cool, his words deliberate. "The girls require new boots. I thought to collect them myself this year. You may accompany me, if you wish." There had been no smile, no warmth, and yet the offer had stirred something in her. A thread, frayed and fragile, stretching toward the possibility of something unspoken. Now, as the sleigh moved through the sleeping countryside, Elizabeth allowed herself the quiet luxury of studying him beneath the brim of her bonnet. His profile was sculpted in sharp lines, dusted with the faintest stubble. The wind had drawn a hint of color to his cheeks, though it did not soften him. Nothing about Gideon Ashcombe was soft. He was marble-made man, cold, precise, silent, and yet, beneath that silence, there was pain. She could feel it like a pulse beneath the surface of the snow. They passed a thicket of birch trees, their pale trunks silvered by frost, and still he said nothing. Elizabeth turned her gaze forward, the wind catching the edge of her veil. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He glanced at her. "It's quiet. Sometimes quiet is what beauty wears when it grieves." For a moment, the air thickened. He looked at her again, longer this time, and something in his eyes shifted. A shadow flickered, a crack in the ice. "My late wife used to despise these winters," he said finally, his voice low. "She said the cold reminded her of boarding school. Unloved corridors, frozen toes. She longed for Italy, for sun and color." Elizabeth nodded slowly, unsure of whether to speak, but his gaze remained distant. "She was delicate," he continued, "restless, never content for long. The girls were a burden to her. She loved them in her way, but she feared what motherhood demanded, the confinement, the selflessness. She feared disappearing," Elizabeth said gently. He turned to her, surprised. Elizabeth met his eyes. "Some women are taught to shine only when admired, when the mirror cracks. They do not know how to survive without their reflection." His face was still. Then he looked away. "She died afraid," he murmured. "And I had grown so tired of her fears." There it was, the crack, not in his voice but in his breath, in the way his hand flexed against the reins. He had loved her, perhaps, or perhaps he had simply failed her. Either wound could bleed for a lifetime. Elizabeth said nothing. She offered no forgiveness, no comfort, only silence, quiet, understanding silence. They arrived in town, made their purchases, and returned before the light began to dim. He did not thank her, But when he helped her down from the sleigh, his fingers lingered half a second longer against her gloved hand. That night, as the girls sat beside the parlor fire embroidering by lamplight, Louisa looked up suddenly. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. Elizabeth looked over. "What, darling?" "The whispering. From the wall, behind my wardrobe. Sometimes I wake up and it's there, like someone breathing secrets." Elizabeth's blood chilled. Cecily blinked, leaning into her sister. "It's only the wind." Louisa shook her head. "It's a woman's voice. She says my name. She says, 'Don't forget.'" Elizabeth's heart beat louder in her chest. She stood slowly. "Louisa, will you show me?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. They ascended the stairs together, the candlelight flickering against the wallpaper as they turned down the corridor toward the nursery wing. The room smelled of lavender and starch. The wardrobe stood in the far corner, tall and old, its wood slightly warped by age. Louisa pointed. "It comes from there." Elizabeth waited until the girls were settled in bed, then returned alone. The wardrobe creaked as she opened it. Inside, the usual garments, folded shawls, neatly hung cloaks, a small box of slippers. But as she ran her fingers along the back panel, she felt something unusual. Uneven wood, a narrow seam, a hidden space. She reached into her sewing basket for the thimble, slipped it along the edge, and pressed. A section of the back gave way. Within the hollow, tucked between the wall and the panel, was a letter. Its paper was yellowed, the handwriting neat and slanted, the ink faded but legible. She unfolded it slowly. "Dearest sister, he doesn't know what I saw. He doesn't know what she whispered to me in those last days, when the candles burned low and her hands trembled. I fear for the girls if I—" The final line trailed off. There was no signature, but Elizabeth recognized the handwriting. It matched the label inside the book she had found in the dressing room. Isadora. Her breath caught. The sister had been here, not just in stories or in whispers, but truly here, writing letters, watching, afraid. The paper trembled in Elizabeth's hand. A creak behind her made her turn sharply. No one. But the candle flickered in protest. She folded the letter and slipped it into the bodice of her gown. As she stepped back into the corridor, she felt the house around her shift. Not in bricks, not in stone, but in memory. The silence had teeth, and she had begun to uncover its voice. A pale fog draped itself over Ashcombe that morning, like a morning veil too weary to be lifted. The winter sun, weak and flickering, filtered through the long windows of the east parlour in streaks of ivory and gold. Elizabeth Langley sat alone at a small writing table, the quiet ticking of the mantel clock keeping her company as she turned the yellowed pages of an architectural ledger she had found in the study's far cabinet. The book was large and bound in dark calfskin, its cover etched with the Ashcombe crest. Inside, each page bore meticulous floor plans of the estate, drawn in ink with the precision of a surveyor's hand. Drawing room, library, guest chambers, east stairwell, nursery, servants' hall. But it was the west wing that held her focus. She traced the outline of a corridor she had walked just the day before, fingers following its lines until they came to an abrupt end. A door, but not the one she had unlocked with the ribboned key. This one opened into a small square room at the farthest end of the hall, a room she had never seen, a room not present in any of the daily household routines. Her heart quickened. The next few hours passed like a breath held too long. She sat through Cecily's recitation of her reading primer, listened to Louisa's halting French lessons, smiled and nodded as the girls braided embroidery floss. But her thoughts stayed fixed on the hidden space behind those ancient stone walls. That evening, long after the children had gone to bed and the last of the embers glowed low in the drawing-room hearth, Elizabeth returned to the west wing. The corridor was colder than the rest of the house. The air here did not shift. It waited. The tapestries that lined the walls swayed ever so slightly, as if some draught breathed beneath them. She moved slowly, Holding a single brass candlestick, the light danced across the embroidered scenes of hunting parties and crowned stags, their thread worn thin by time. Then, there it was, a seam. At the far end of the corridor, hidden in the folds of a massive tapestry depicting a medieval coronation, she found a slight misalignment, a part of the fabric lifted too easily. Behind it, stone but not unbroken, a narrow vertical slit, nearly invisible, ran down the wall. She pressed her hand against it. Nothing. Then a groan, a soft wooden creak above her head. She looked up. The beam beside the lintel was carved with a motif, a rose vine entwining a shield. It matched a smaller version in the ledger's drawings. With a deep breath, she reached up and pushed. A click echoed, soft as a sigh. The wall yielded. A hidden door swung open, revealing darkness beyond. Elizabeth stepped inside. The room smelled of dust and old linen, of lavender water long since faded. The air was heavy with silence so thick it felt holy. She raised her candle. It was a nursery, smaller than the current one, forgotten. The wallpaper, now faded to ivory and grey, had once been a pale blue adorned with vines of tiny roses. A rocking horse stood in the corner, its paint chipped, its mane made of real hair. A cradle with a yellowed muslin canopy rested beneath the window. The panes were fogged, the curtains half rotted, and on the floor, a scattering of wooden blocks undisturbed by time. She stepped further, the wooden boards creaking beneath her boots. Something called to her, not with sound, but with presence. She knelt by the far wall, near a built-in bench meant for storing toys. The floor beneath it groaned when she shifted her weight. One board felt loose. She set the candle down and pried at the board with her fingertips. It lifted. Inside was a shallow cavity. Within it, a bundle wrapped in faded linen tied with blue ribbon. She pulled it gently from its hiding place and set it on the floor beside her. Hands trembling, she unwrapped the cloth. Letters, dozens of them, folded, sealed, some still bearing the faint scent of lavender, each addressed to the same name, Clarissa, Duchess of Ashcombe, each signed, Isadora. Elizabeth's breath caught. She opened the first, the paper delicate as petals. My dearest sister, you do not sleep. I hear you pacing. I hear you weep through the walls, and I do not know how to help you. You say you see shadows in the mirror. You say the walls whisper. You say the nursemaid lies. I believe you, Clarissa, and I will not let them take the girls, even if it means taking them myself. Another letter. Something is wrong with the tonics Mrs. Graves prepares. You must stop drinking them. You must. Another. He watches you differently now. You say you no longer recognize him. You must not be alone with him. Another still. If I vanish, know this. I did not leave of my own will, and I love you, always. Elizabeth's hands shook. She reached for the final letter in the bundle, folded tighter than the others. It bore no address, no seal. As she unfolded it, two things fell from between the pages, a pressed wildflower and a lock of golden hair tied with a violet thread. Elizabeth stared at it, breathless. The hair was not Clarissa's. She had seen the Duchess's portrait. Her hair had been dark, nearly raven black. This was Isadora's, golden, light as sunshine. She pressed the flower between her fingers, and it crumbled slightly from age. The letter, smudged with what might have been tears, was brief. I no longer know whom to trust. Someone in this house wants silence more than truth, but I will not be silent. I will take them tonight. The date was 3 days before Clarissa's death. Elizabeth folded the letter carefully, her breath catching in her throat. The room pressed in around her, the silence thick and pulsing. She placed the bundle back into the floor cavity, except for the lock of hair and the flower, which she folded inside her handkerchief and slipped into her bodice. As she stepped into the corridor again, closing the hidden door behind her, she paused. At the far end of the hall, just beyond the reach of the candlelight, stood Louisa. Barefoot in her nightdress, her eyes wide and glistening. Was she real? The child whispered. Isadora. Elizabeth knelt slowly. Yes, my darling, she was. Louisa swallowed. Did she love us? Elizabeth opened her arms. The child flew into them, and behind them the tapestry swayed as if breathing once more. The snow returned with a vengeance that morning, blanketing Ashcombe in a hush so absolute it muffled even the tolling of the distant church bells. Flakes drifted like ash from a grieving sky, clinging to the stone balustrades and piling gently along the windowsills. Indoors, the air was still, save for the soft creak of floorboards and the steady beat of Elizabeth Langley's heart. She stood in the corridor outside the study, the letters from Isadora folded neatly in her gloved hand. The lock of golden hair had been returned to its silk pouch and hidden among her belongings, but the words, those inked fears, those cries for help, burned hotter than any fire. She had read each line again and again. She had traced the handwriting with her fingertips, searching for some flaw, some falsehood, and found none. Every stroke of the pen had been shaped by urgency, by devotion, and by dread. And now she would no longer remain silent. A knock, firm and controlled. A voice within. Enter. Gideon Ashcombe stood near the hearth, his tall figure outlined in the flickering light. He wore a dark cravat, his waistcoat buttoned high, his posture rigid. The fire cast flickers of orange across his pale face, but his eyes, those eyes of storm-blue glass, held no welcome. Elizabeth crossed the room and stopped several steps away from him. "There is something I must show you," she said quietly. His gaze shifted to her hands. "What is it now?" She unfolded the first letter with care and offered it to him. "From Isadora, your wife's sister." He took it slowly, his fingers grazing hers, with a tension that sent a shiver down her spine. Not of fear, but of something far more difficult to name. He read, and as he did, the line between his brows deepened. His jaw clenched. By the second letter, he had begun pacing. By the third, he had stopped altogether. Then he looked at her. "Where did you find these?" Elizabeth held his gaze. "Hidden in a room behind the West Wing, a nursery that has not been touched in years." His expression darkened. "That room was sealed for a reason." "Perhaps," she replied, "but not for a just one." Gideon exhaled slowly, folding the letters in half and setting them on the mantel as if they burned to the touch. "You weren't here," he said at last. "You didn't see her at the end. My wife, Clarissa, she lost her grasp on reality after our son was born still. She began to see things, hear things, accused the staff of poisoning her, accused me of wanting her dead." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "And did you?" His head snapped toward her, his voice low, sharp. "No." She nodded once. "Then why did you send Isadora away?" A beat passed, then another. She threatened to remove the girls, said Clarissa was unfit, that she would go to the authorities, that I was negligent. "And were you?" He stepped closer. "I did everything I could. I begged Clarissa to rest, to eat, to see a physician. But she refused. She locked herself in her rooms, screamed when anyone approached, except Isadora. Then why exile the only person who could reach her?" His voice dropped, a murmur wrapped in steel. "Because Isadora made her worse." Elizabeth searched his face, "or because she saw something you didn't want her to name." Gideon's silence was thunderous. Then behind them, a small voice broke the tension like glass against stone. "I saw them fight." They turned. Louisa stood in the doorway, her hands curled into fists at her sides, her nightdress hanging like a ghost silhouette around her small frame. Her eyes, so much like her father's, were wide, distant. Elizabeth stepped toward her gently. "What did you see, sweetheart?" Louisa looked down at her feet. "Mama and Aunt Isadora. They were in the West Wing. I was hiding under the table. They didn't know I was there." She lifted her gaze, lips trembling. "Mama was crying. She said someone was lying to her. She said she couldn't trust anyone. Then Aunt Isadora yelled. She said she would take us away, that she'd write to a magistrate. Mama screamed. She threw something. It hit the mirror. Then Aunt Isadora left." "And then?" Elizabeth asked softly. Louisa blinked. "She never came back." A silence bloomed in the room, thick and aching. Gideon turned away. He gripped the edge of the mantel until his knuckles whitened. Elizabeth knelt and pulled Louisa into her arms. "It's all right," she whispered. "You did well." That afternoon, Elizabeth walked the corridors of Ashcombe with new eyes. Every shadow seemed to lean toward her, every closed door hummed with secrets. She passed maids who turned their eyes downward, who curtsied too quickly. She heard the clatter of dishes cease when she entered the scullery. And always, she felt Mrs. Graves nearby, watching. As dusk fell, she found the housekeeper alone in the linen room, folding blankets with mechanical precision. "You knew," Elizabeth said quietly. Mrs. Graves did not look up. "I know many things, madam. You knew Isadora never left this house of her own will. You knew Clarissa feared for her children. You knew about the nursery." Mrs. Graves folded a blanket slowly. "And yet here you stand, alive. Which is more than I can say for others who ask too many questions." Elizabeth's blood chilled. "What are you implying?" The housekeeper turned to face her at last. Her eyes were not cruel, but tired, deeply, bitterly tired. "I am telling you what no one else will. Some things are better left buried. You have a roof, a title, 2 girls who cling to your skirts. Don't lose that chasing ghosts." Elizabeth held her gaze. "Perhaps what you fear is not ghosts, but truth." Mrs. Graves's mouth twitched. Not a smile, but the memory of one. "Be careful on the stairs, madam," she said softly. "They're slippery when one's not looking." The words followed Elizabeth down the hall like a chill up her spine. That evening, after supper, she crossed the upper corridor near the north stairwell. The girls were in bed, the lamps had been lowered, and the house lay in its usual hush. As she descended the stairs, her slipper touched something hard. A jolt of instinct flared. She looked down. There, on the next step, lay a porcelain doll. Its face was cracked, its glass eyes open, one arm missing. She had not seen it before. Her foot slipped, the world spun. She fell, twisting, catching the banister just in time to stop her full descent. Her shoulder struck the edge. Pain flared white. The doll rolled down the stairs and shattered at the base. Silence. Then, footsteps. Mrs. Graves appeared at the top of the landing, holding a candle. Her face remained unreadable. Elizabeth stared up at her, breath shallow, pain radiating through her arm. The housekeeper said nothing, only turned and vanished down the hall. Elizabeth lay there for a moment, the pain and shock settling into her bones. Then she rose, slowly, painfully, her fingers curling around the broken banister. The house had shown its teeth, and now she would bare hers. Snow drifted in slow, deliberate spirals past the windows of Ashcombe, cloaking the grounds in a silence deeper than usual, as though even the wind dared not disturb the house's secrets. The corridor outside Elizabeth's room lay dim and still, lit only by the faint flicker of a brass wall sconce. Somewhere below, a clock chimed once, a low, mournful sound that dissolved into the quiet. Inside her chamber, the fire burned low, its glow throwing shadows across the high plaster ceiling. Elizabeth Langley lay propped against pillows in the 4-poster bed, her arm bound in a sling, her breath quiet but uneven. Her fall had left her bruised, shaken, and aching through bone and sinew, but not broken. No, something deeper than bone had begun to strengthen. Something fierce, forged in silence and defiance. A child's head rested on her uninjured shoulder. Cecily. The little girl had refused to leave her side for 2 days and 2 nights. She curled now like a kitten beneath the covers, one small hand tangled in the lace edge of Elizabeth's nightgown, her breathing steady, rhythmic, and full of innocent trust. Elizabeth didn't sleep. Sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought the memory of that porcelain face, cracked and smiling at the foot of the stairs, before the darkness swallowed her. There was a rustle at the door. She turned her head just as it opened. Gideon Ashcombe stepped inside. He did not wear his coat, only his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, both creased and clinging with fatigue. A book rested in his hands, one she recognized immediately. The bundle of letters, bound now in leather cord. She didn't speak. He moved to the chair beside the bed and sat, slowly, as if the air between them had grown too thick to move through easily. "I've read them," he said at last. Elizabeth lowered her gaze to Cecily's soft curls. "And?" He was silent for a long time. Then I sent Isadora away because I thought she was making things worse. Clarissa's mind was fragile, and I didn't want the children witnessing her unraveling. Isadora accused me of neglect. She demanded I let her take the girls. I told her no. I gave orders for her to be escorted from the house. I believed she returned to her family in London. Elizabeth's voice was quiet but firm. She never did. He nodded slowly, hands clasped in his lap, his knuckles white. I wrote to her once. Weeks after Clarissa died, there was no reply. I assumed she blamed me, that she chose not to answer. His voice faltered, and for a moment she saw something raw slip through his composure. Grief, guilt, or perhaps both, mingled like ash in water. She trusted you, Elizabeth said gently. Even in the letters, she believed you would protect the girls, if not for her, for them. Gideon's jaw tightened. I failed them, all of them. She turned her head to look at him fully, the firelight painting soft amber across his cheekbones. No, she whispered. You closed your eyes, but you did not mean harm. His gaze lifted, meeting hers. A long silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they would not yet name. Then, softly, he asked, "May I stay?" Elizabeth nodded. He did not move closer. He simply sat there, his presence calm, steady. The fire crackled, the child breathed, and the house outside them slept. The next morning, when Elizabeth stirred, she found Gideon asleep in the chair, his head bowed forward, the book still resting in his lap. Cecily had already slipped from the bed and left a half-eaten biscuit on the nightstand. Elizabeth rose slowly, wincing with the movement, and walked to the wardrobe where Mrs. Graves had once stored garments of the former Duchess. Her fingers moved with purpose now, not driven by curiosity, but by instinct. There were answers still cloaked in cloth and lavender-scented dust. She pulled out a shawl, folded carefully, its edge trimmed in fine lace. The scent struck her first, faint but preserved, like a whisper of what had once been perfume and something more clinical, something dry, bitter. She unfolded it. A small, hidden pocket had been sewn into the corner seam, invisible unless one knew where to look. She reached in. Her fingers closed around something round and cool. A vial, glass, thin, corked. Inside it, a pale white powder, fine and dry, like sugar crushed to dust. Her breath caught. She turned the vial in her hand, holding it up to the window. The light filtered through it like snowlight through milk. She pressed it against her palm, then opened the drawer of the nightstand where Clarissa's old medical journal had been kept. Another discovery she had made in the West Wing's hidden nursery days before. She flipped to the last written page. Symptoms persistent, fatigue, hallucinations, tremors, disoriented speech, dull ache behind eyes, sensitivity to light, loss of appetite, perspiration in sleep, pain in stomach, bones feel hollow, elixir from graves burns throat, bitterness remains even in diluted tea, cannot refuse. He watches now when she stirs it. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she lowered the book. Gideon stirred. His voice was rough with sleep. "What is it?" She turned, the vial in her hand. "She was right," she said softly. "Someone was poisoning her." His face blanched. He rose from the chair slowly, took the vial from her, examined it with growing horror. "And you believe it was Graves?" "I don't know," Elizabeth answered honestly. "But she was the one preparing the tonics." Clarissa feared her. And Isadora knew something. The Duke's mouth was a hard line, his shoulders rigid with restrained fury. I dismissed her cries as hysteria. She was mourning, Elizabeth said. And mourning makes a woman fragile, but that does not make her a liar. He looked at her then, eyes heavy with what could not be undone. What do I do now? Elizabeth took the vial from his hand and pressed it back into his palm. You listen, she whispered. You listen until the walls of this house tell you the truth. Outside, the snow began to fall again, but inside, for the first time in years, something had begun to thaw. The snow had melted into the earth like grief absorbed in silence. For the first time in many weeks, the air around Ashcombe held the faintest whisper of spring, of something shifting beneath the frozen surface. fragile but inevitable. The trees, bare and black against a pewter sky, stood like quiet sentinels waiting. Inside the manor, the corridors remained hushed, though not with the same suffocating silence as before. There was a difference now, a tension that pulsed not only from walls soaked in secrets, but from truth pressing to the surface, like sap rising in the veins of trees. Elizabeth stood by the window in the main parlor, one hand resting lightly on the drapery, the other holding the vial of white powder she had placed inside a handkerchief and tied with a ribbon. The ribbon had once belonged to Cecily. It now wrapped around a truth far too old and too dangerous to be carried bare. She heard the door open behind her. Gideon. He crossed the threshold slowly, his footfall heavy but resolute. He had not shaved that morning. His collar was slightly loose, and his eyes carried the weight of nights without peace. He said nothing, but his presence filled the room like a tide turning at last. "She's in her quarters," Elizabeth said quietly. "She won't expect you. I intend no cruelty." She turned to him. Cruelty would be to say nothing at all. He nodded once. Then, without another word, he turned and left. Elizabeth watched him disappear into the corridor. She did not follow. It was not her confrontation to lead. Gideon walked the length of the hallway with deliberate slowness, passing portraits that had once judged him with silent eyes. Today, he looked back at them unflinching. When he reached the housekeeper's chambers, he did not knock. He opened the door. Mrs. Graves sat at her writing desk, sorting through ledgers with the same mechanical order she had brought to every room in Ashcombe. Her cap was slightly askew, and the candle beside her had nearly burned to its end. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Your Grace, we must speak." She rose slowly, folding her hands in front of her. "I imagine we must." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You knew," he said. "You prepared those tonics. You saw her slipping and you did nothing." Mrs. Graves did not flinch. "I did what I was told. She would not eat, would not sleep. She screamed at the staff. She terrified the girls. His Grace ordered that she be calmed. I did my duty." Gideon's voice was cold. "She begged you." "She accused everyone," the woman said, her own voice rising for the first time in years. "Me, the maids, even you. She said the mirrors whispered. She tore her dresses, locked herself in the nursery. Isadora filled her head with fantasies and suspicion." Gideon stared at her. "So you silenced her?" Mrs. Graves looked away. "I only ever mix the laudanum. Drops, as prescribed by the doctor. If something was added later, it was not by me." A long silence passed. "You argued with her the night she died." Mrs. Graves met his eyes then, and for the first time they were not hard, but haunted. "She was going to take the children and leave, said she feared for them, said I had turned them against her. I told her she would break them if she tore them from this place. And then I left her sobbing in her dressing room. That was the last I saw of her." Gideon's voice dropped to a whisper. "And Isadora, I believed she had gone, after she threatened you, after you ordered her away. I never saw her again. But the nursery, I sealed it myself. I scrubbed every trace of it clean, because she was gone, because Clarissa was dead, because the girls were fragile and needed stability, and I couldn't protect them from ghosts." Gideon stepped closer, his voice firm but not cruel. "You may not have poisoned her, Mrs. Graves, but you let her die with no one to hold her hand." Her mouth trembled. He took a breath. "You are relieved of your duties. Your service is acknowledged. You may leave quietly. No name will be blackened, no story told." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. She simply nodded. When he returned to the parlor, Elizabeth was still by the window. She turned slowly to meet him. "She's packing now," he said. "She said very little." "She's said enough," Elizabeth replied. He moved toward the hearth, paused in front of the tall marble mantel. Above it hung the grand portrait of Clarissa Ashcombe. She stared out with that same haunting elegance, her painted eyes clouded with the memory of someone never seen clearly in life. Elizabeth followed his gaze. "There's something behind it," she said softly. Gideon looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I've felt it." when I stand too close, like a pressure, as if something is waiting. Together they reached up and lifted the frame. It gave with surprising ease, revealing not bare wall, but a recess, shallow, lined with silk, once red and now faded to rust. Inside it lay a single envelope. The wax seal had been broken. Elizabeth took it with careful hands and opened it. The letter was short, the ink rushed, the handwriting Clarissa's. If I do not survive tonight, protect them from the truth and from what I may have done in my despair. Elizabeth pressed the letter to her chest. Gideon turned away, his face unreadable. She blamed herself, he said, even as she was fading. She was isolated, Elizabeth whispered. She was desperate, and no one truly listened. He turned back to her. The pain in his eyes was unmasked now. I listened too late. Elizabeth looked up at him. Her voice was steady, but full of something trembling just beneath the surface. And yet you still listen now. He stepped closer. The night you arrived, he said, I saw you as a solution, a necessity, but you are more than that. You have become the quiet that soothes this house, and the voice that wakes it. She drew a breath. I did not come here looking for love, she murmured. Nor did I, he answered, but I find myself offering it. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with truth. Then do not offer it as a vow, she said. Offer it as a choice. Gideon took her hand gently. I choose you, he said, not because of duty, but because love, once buried beneath ashes, had found its breath again. And in that moment, as snow melted from the edges of the windows and light returned to the sky, the house, at last, exhaled. It began, as all true renewals do, not with trumpet or grand decree, but with the soft unfolding of light. Ashcombe stirred beneath the slow breath of April. The skies, once locked in pewter silence, had melted into a pale, forgiving blue. Ivy awakened along the garden walls. Crocuses, delicate and defiant, pierced through the dark earth. The river sang again. The wind, now fragrant with moss and heather, no longer carried secrets, but promises. The manor itself had changed. The heavy velvet drapes were pulled back now, and sun poured into rooms that had long forgotten warmth. The corridors echoed not with dread, but with occasional laughter, the hesitant, healing kind that first tiptoes, then takes root. Elizabeth stood at the balcony just off the south wing, her hand resting lightly on the stone balustrade, a shawl around her shoulders. Below, the garden had erupted into color. Cecily darted among the tulips with ribbons in her hair, her giggles trailing behind her like music. Louisa walked just behind, slower, a small leather-bound sketchbook pressed to her chest. She had begun to draw again, quietly, with care. She didn't show anyone her work, not yet, but she drew, and that was enough. Inside the manor, the scent of lemon oil and beeswax filled the air. A new housekeeper, Miss Alden, had replaced Mrs. Graves. Younger, gentler, and blessedly unaware of the house's past, she moved through Ashcombe with a calm diligence. She smiled at Cecily in the mornings, folded Louisa's shawl when it slipped from her shoulders, and brewed Elizabeth's tea with hands that trembled just a little less each week. In Elizabeth's sitting room, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, dancing along the floorboards. A bouquet of wild primroses, Louisa's first offering, stood in a vase on the table, and in the corner, a single gown of ivory silk, trimmed in soft grey, hung waiting on a dress form. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the delicate fabric as though touching a memory not yet lived. They had renewed their vows that morning. There had been no guests, no procession. Only Gideon and Elizabeth, the girls, and the small chapel hidden behind the rose garden, long closed and unused since Clarissa's death. The chapel had been cleaned in silence. The windows scrubbed, the pews dusted, the altar polished with lavender oil and reverence. Louisa had placed a folded drawing at the base of the lectern, a simple sketch of their family, 4 figures standing together beneath a tree. It had taken her days to finish it, and she had not crossed anyone out. Elizabeth remembered the feel of Gideon's hand as he placed hers over his heart, the quiet tremble in his voice as he repeated words not written in prayer books, but in truth. He had not promised grandeur. He had not promised ease, but he had promised to stay, to hold, to listen, to begin again. And that had been enough. Now, as the afternoon ripened with golden light, Elizabeth descended the garden steps slowly. The hem of her pale grey walking dress brushed the newly swept stones. She made her way across the lawn toward the family cemetery, hidden just beyond the apple trees, where the branches now bloomed in soft white clusters. Louisa waited there. She stood before the headstone of her mother, a bundle of daffodils cradled in her arms. The stone, weathered by wind and silence, bore only Clarissa's name, the dates of her short life, and nothing more. No epitaph, no verse. Elizabeth stopped a few paces behind, allowing space. Louisa knelt slowly, her fingers trembling as she laid the flowers at the base of the stone. She remained there for a moment, silent, still. Then her voice, quiet but steady. "Mama." The name hung in the air like a bird taking flight. She did not cry. She did not speak again. She simply rose, brushed her hands gently against her skirt, and turned to Elizabeth. "I think she hears me now." Elizabeth opened her arms. Louisa stepped into them. They stayed there for a long time, held not by grief, but by understanding. Later, Gideon joined them near the gate. His coat was unfastened, his hair tousled by the breeze. He placed a hand on Elizabeth's back and nodded once to Louisa, who returned the gesture with the faintest of smiles. Together they walked back toward the house, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. At the garden's edge, Cecily ran to them, a crown of daisies in her hands. She lifted it toward Elizabeth with an expectant grin. "It's for you, Mama," she said. The words struck like sunlight against stone. Elizabeth knelt, allowing the child to place it atop her head. The petals brushed her cheeks. She laughed softly, something inside her breaking open and staying open. From the balcony above, the lace curtains billowed. From the parlor, a faint melody drifted, Louisa playing the piano with uncertain fingers. And in the rose garden beyond, the chapel doors remained open, the scent of wax and spring flowers mingling in the air. Ashcombe, once silent and heavy with memory, now pulsed with life. Not perfection, but life. As the equinox sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and rose, Elizabeth stood beside Gideon near the edge of the orchard. His hand found hers. No words were spoken. They did not need them. In the distance, the girls ran through the grass, chasing one another through the dandelions. Their laughter rose like birdsong, echoing through the trees. And Elizabeth, no longer a stranger, no longer a shadow, watched them with eyes full of light. A duchess reborn not by title but by choice. And at last, she was not forgotten. She was home. Ashcombe, spring of 1855. The land had changed, as all things do with time and tenderness. The old sycamore near the orchard had grown broader, its roots reaching deeper into the softened soil. The garden, once kept out of duty, now bloomed from habit and love, its roses curling around trellises as if remembering every hand that once tended them. But the house was no longer haunted. Its windows were open now, its halls filled not with echoes but with footsteps. Light, living footsteps that marked the passing of years like the hands of a clock, tracing circles in sunlight. On the southern lawn, beneath the budding branches of a cherry tree, a blanket was spread across the grass. A child no older than 5 sat there cross-legged, curls as dark as honey tumbling over his brow, his hands clutching a wooden soldier painted in faded red. He spoke softly to himself, his voice laced with imagination. "Papa says this one's from the Crimea," he whispered to the soldier, "but Mama says he was too young for war." From the shadow of the veranda, Elizabeth watched him, a soft smile curving her lips. Her gown, a shade of blue so pale it nearly disappeared in the light, rippled in the breeze. Her hair, streaked now with a few strands of silver, was pulled back in the same gentle twist she had worn for nearly a decade. Simple, dignified hers. Gideon stepped beside her, the years having settled on him not with cruelty but with quiet. His temples had turned silver, and his face, once guarded and hard, had learned softness. He slipped his hand into hers, still without words, because their silences had long since become fluent with meaning. "He's named them all," Elizabeth said, nodding toward their youngest. Gideon chuckled under his breath. "All but the one he left in the bath yesterday. He says that one can't swim," she replied. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the boy draw a circle in the dirt with the soldier's feet. Beyond the cherry tree, the voices of young women rang through the garden. Louisa, now 17, walked arm in arm with her sister Cecily, 15, down the gravel path toward the greenhouse. Louisa wore a linen apron smudged with paint, a satchel slung across her shoulder. She had recently begun accepting commissions, portraits for the vicar's family, landscapes for the town hall. Her gift had blossomed quietly, steadily, like herself. Cecily, ever bright, had taken to botany. The walls of the greenhouse were lined with her experiments, pressed specimens, hand-labeled with neat, graceful script. She often wrote letters to universities under a pseudonym, just to see if her ideas would be taken seriously. They usually were. The girls passed their younger brother and ruffled his hair in tandem. He frowned, then laughed, returning to his toys as they disappeared into the hedgerow, their laughter trailing behind like a ribbon on the wind. Elizabeth turned her face to the sun. 8 years had passed since she had arrived at Ashcombe. 8 years since she had walked into a house cloaked in sorrow and silence. She had not expected joy, had not expected love. But life, as it often does, had broken through the cracks. It had filled the quiet with warmth and had given her more than she dared imagine. They had named their son August, for the month he had come and for the dignity with which he had softened Gideon's grief. He had Clarissa's eyes, and yet, when he smiled, Elizabeth saw only Gideon. Mrs. Graves had left the house quietly, just as instructed. She had retired to a small cottage near Devon. Word had come years later that she had taken in an orphaned girl, raising her with an austere tenderness that surprised those who knew her past. She never returned to Ashcombe, and her name was not spoken often, but when it was with the complicated reverence one gives to a chapter long closed, but never erased. As for Isadora, her name lived in the house, like a prayer. Louisa kept one of her letters pressed into the back of her sketchbook, her small, careful handwriting once having traced the lines of her aunt's looping cursive. Gideon had made inquiries through the years, but no family in London claimed to have seen her again. Some believed she had run. Elizabeth believed otherwise. In the corner of the chapel, beneath a climbing rose vine, a plaque had been placed by Elizabeth's own hand. For Isadora, sister, guardian, light, not forgotten, not silent. Inside the house, the staff had changed, modernized, softened. The nursery was now a library. Elizabeth's sitting room had become the heart of the household, where tea was taken, where decisions were discussed, and where Gideon sometimes sat reading aloud to August as the boy drifted into sleep. The world beyond Ashcombe had changed too. Telegraph wires now lined the distant road. The train had begun its reach toward the northern counties. Elizabeth, ever quiet, ever dignified, sometimes wrote to women she had once known in Bath, women who had not imagined her life turning out this way. They often asked if she had been lucky. She never answered that word, because what she had found was not luck. It was endurance. It was a home built not on marble or title, but on forgiveness, on truth, on the steady, often painful beauty of choosing one another every day. The wind carried the sound of church bells from the village, 3 chimes for the 3rd hour. August stood and began to march his soldier toward the porch, his voice rising in an imaginary drumbeat. Elizabeth turned to Gideon, her eyes reflecting years of sunlight and storm. "We grew something here," she said softly. He brought her hand to his lips. "No," he murmured. "You did." And behind them, the house stood bathed in golden light, no longer a place of ghosts, but of memory, of healing, and of love that had not only survived the passage of time, it had become timeless. Sometimes love doesn't arrive wrapped in joy. Sometimes it walks through the door wearing grief, silence, and the weight of the past. But as we've seen in Ashcombe, even the coldest halls can bloom again. Elizabeth's story is not just about romance. It's about second chances, about finding light after darkness, and about how healing doesn't always come loudly. It comes in small, quiet gestures. A child's laughter, a shared glance, a name finally spoken without fear. This story reminds us that even when we feel forgotten, overlooked, or broken, we are never truly lost. Love can find us again, and when it does not ask us to be perfect. It only asks us to be open. If this journey moved you, touched you, or made you feel a little less alone in your own story, I invite you to leave a comment below. Share your favorite moment, or simply write the word "bloom" so I know you stayed with us until the very end. It means the world. If you'd like to support the small, passionate team that brings these historical love stories to life, you can now send us a super thanks here on YouTube. Any amount you feel inspired to give helps us continue creating with care and heart. And if you can't support us that way right now, sharing this story with a friend, sibling, or someone you know who loves period dramas is just as meaningful. It's how our little corner of nostalgia, love, and resilience continues to grow. You can also check out more of our emotional, romantic tales in the video cards at the end. We think you'll fall in love all over again. Thank you for watching, for feeling, for remembering. Until our next story, may your heart always find its way back to the light.